In the spring of 1887, in a dusty little town called Larkspur, Texas, there was a young woman named Odessa Callaway who hadn't smiled in public in 6 years. Not because she didn't want to. Because every time she did, people looked away first. She was 16 when the barn fire took half her left cheek and most of the hearing in that ear. She was 22 now, and the whole town still called her the Callaway girl who got burned, like the accident was the only interesting thing about her. But what happened the day Weston Mallister rode into Larkspur and chose her, in front of everybody, is the kind of thing folks in that county still talk about. And by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who believes the ones written off by everybody else usually turn out to be the strongest ones in the room, do me a favor and hit that like button, share this with somebody who needs a little hope today, and subscribe if you're new here. Alright, let's get into it. Odessa lived with her mother, Ruth, and her younger brother, Cyrus, on 40 acres just outside town, land her father had scraped together before he passed from consumption. It wasn't much. A modest herd of cattle, a garden, a leaning fence line that never quite held. Odessa did the books, mended the fence, and kept the household running on grit and stubbornness. Her mother loved her fiercely, but even Ruth couldn't stop the whispering every time Odessa walked into the mercantile. The town of Larkspur sat right in Texas Hill Country, and in 1887, that region was in the middle of something that had nothing to do with Odessa's scar and everything to do with wire. Barbed wire. If you don't know the history, here's the short version, and it matters for what happens later. For decades, Texas ranchers ran cattle on open range, meaning the land wasn't fenced, and herds grazed freely across property lines by unspoken custom. Then barbed wire got cheap and available, and big ranchers started fencing off huge stretches of land, sometimes even fencing off water that smaller farmers and ranchers depended on. It sparked what folks called the fence-cutting wars, where small landowners, furious about losing access to grass and water, would sneak out at night and cut the wire strand by strand. It got so bad the Texas legislature had to pass laws in 1884 making fence cutting a felony, while also making it illegal to fence off land you didn't actually own, especially water sources. By 1887, the wars had mostly quieted down, but the resentment hadn't. And the biggest landowner in the county was a man named Silas Mallister, who ran nearly 9,000 acres of prime grazing land and had fenced off a stretch of the Callaway family's traditional water access 2 years back, legal on paper, brutal in practice. Ruth Callaway had written him 3 letters asking for a shared water agreement. All 3 went unanswered. So when Silas Mallister's only son, Weston, rode up to the Callaway property on a spring afternoon looking for a stray bull that had wandered onto their land, Odessa was not in a friendly mood. She was up on a ladder patching the barn roof when she heard hoofs. She turned, sun in her eyes, scarred cheek fully visible, and braced for the look. The look she got from everyone. The flinch, the quick recovery, the too polite smile. Weston Mallister didn't do any of that. He looked up at her, squinted against the sun, and said, "Ma'am, I think my daddy's bull wandered onto your land again, and I'm awful sorry about it." That was it. No flinch. No stare. Just an apology about a bull. Odessa climbed down, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "Your daddy's bull isn't the only thing of his that wandered where it wasn't wanted." She meant the fence. She meant the water. Weston's face went a little red, and he nodded slow. "You're talking about the west water line," he said. "I am. I know it wasn't right. I told him so myself. He didn't listen to me either." That surprised her. Nobody in that family had ever admitted the fence was wrong, not once, not in 2 years of letters. Weston helped her round up the bull, and before he left, he asked if he could come back next week to look at the fence line himself, see if there was something he could do about it, even if his father wouldn't budge. Odessa said he could do what he liked. She didn't expect him to actually come back. He came back. Over the next 2 months, Weston Mallister showed up nearly every week. Sometimes to talk about the water dispute, which he was quietly working on behind his father's back, drafting a shared access agreement he hoped to eventually push through. Sometimes just to talk. He asked Odessa about the cattle prices she'd negotiated in San Antonio, which were better than what most ranchers in the county were getting, because she'd taught herself to read shipping manifests and rail freight rates so nobody could cheat her family at the stockyards. He asked how she'd learned that. She told him her father used to say a woman who understands numbers can't be fooled by a man who thinks she can't. Weston started bringing her books. Real ones on cattle breeding and range management, things his own tutors back east had used. He wasn't courting her with flowers. He was courting her with respect, which Odessa had gone 6 years without receiving from anybody outside her own family. The town noticed, of course. Larkspur was small enough that everybody noticed everything. And the whispering that used to just be about Odessa's scar became something meaner. People said Weston Mallister was slumming, or that he felt sorry for her, or that he was only doing it to spite his father, who by then had heard about the visits and was furious. Silas Mallister had bigger plans for his son, namely a marriage to the daughter of a banking family in Austin that would double his land holdings through the arrangement. A scarred farm girl with 40 acres and a stubborn streak was not part of that plan. Silas called Weston into his study one evening in July and laid it out plain. He'd cut Weston off entirely, no land, no cattle, no inheritance, if his son kept making a fool of himself over the Callaway girl. Weston sat there and listened to the whole thing, and then he asked his father one question. He asked why the water agreement he drafted, the one that would let 3 struggling families access the stream that ran through Mallister land, hadn't been signed yet, when it cost the ranch almost nothing and would keep the peace with every small landowner in the county. Silas didn't have a good answer. He just repeated that it wasn't Weston's place to negotiate Mallister business. Weston signed it anyway. He didn't have legal authority to do it, not yet, but he rode out to the Callaway place and to 2 neighboring farms and told them the water access was theirs, effective immediately, and that if his father tried to fence it off again, Weston would take the matter to the county land office himself, since Texas law was clear that you couldn't fence off a natural water source that others depended on. It was, technically, exactly the kind of thing that used to get people's fences cut in the night 10 years earlier, except this time it was the rancher's own son doing right by the law instead of a farmer doing wrong by the fence. That night, Odessa's mother cried at the kitchen table for the first time since her husband died, not from sadness, but from relief. 2 years of scraping by with barely enough water for the herd, solved in an afternoon by a Mallister. But the town of Larkspur held its annual harvest social that September, and that's where everything came to a head. It was the one event where everybody showed up, from the wealthiest ranchers to the poorest sharecroppers, all crowded into the same barn dance under the same paper lanterns. Weston asked Odessa to be his partner for the opening dance, which was, in a town like Larkspur in 1887, about as public a declaration as a man could make. Odessa almost said no. Not because she didn't want to. Because she knew what would happen the second she walked onto that floor with her scarred face in full view of 300 people who'd spent 6 years looking away from her. She said yes anyway. When they walked out onto that barn floor, the fiddle music stopped for just a second too long, and you could feel the whole room holding its breath. Somebody near the punch bowl laughed, quiet and cruel, the kind of laugh meant to be heard. Weston stopped, turned toward the sound, and said loud enough for the whole barn to hear it, that he'd looked at a lot of faces in his life, including faces that smiled at him just because of his family's land, and none of them ever looked at him the way Odessa Callaway looked at a problem that needed solving. He said he'd rather spend his life next to somebody who fixed fences and read freight manifests than somebody who'd never had to fix anything at all. Silas Mallister was standing near the back of that barn, and everyone said later that he went stiff as a fence post. But he didn't say a word. He watched his son dance with the Callaway girl in front of the whole county, and something in his face changed, the same way it had changed a little the day he found out his son had signed away water rights he'd been too stubborn to share himself. 6 months later, Weston and Odessa married in the same barn where they danced. Silas Mallister came to the wedding. He didn't say much, but he brought the deed to an additional 20 acres bordering the Callaway land as a gift, land that happened to include full, permanent water rights, no conditions attached. Some folks in town said it was guilt. Others said it was pride, watching his son do something braver than he'd ever managed himself. Either way, it was done. Odessa never did stop hearing whispers about her scar. That never fully went away, not in a town that's small. But she stopped flinching from them, because for the first time in 6 years, somebody's opinion mattered more to her than the whispering ever could, and that somebody had chosen her in front of everyone on purpose, with his eyes wide open. The water agreement Weston drew up that summer became something of a model in the county. A few years later, when the county finally organized formal water-sharing districts to prevent exactly the kind of range wars that had torn through Texas in the 1880s, the McAllister-Callaway Agreement was one of the examples local officials pointed to, proof that a rancher and a small farmer could share a stream without cutting a single strand of wire. Odessa Callaway McAllister lived on that land for the rest of her life, and she was buried, decades later, next to the fence line that started it all, the one Weston fixed not because he was falling for her yet, but because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes that's how the biggest love stories start. Not with a grand gesture, but with somebody finally treating you like a person worth being fair to. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one, and drop a like before you go so this reaches somebody else who needs a reminder that being overlooked isn't the same as being unworthy. See you in the next story.